Good afternoon. I'm going to go over the Cold War. One thing to keep in mind in this slideshow, most of them have videos that are embedded in the notes. For instance, here, George Kennan's long telegram. So you should watch these as well to give yourself more of an in-depth understanding for each topic. What I'm going to do is just broadly summarize. All right. So first, the essential question is, was a post-World War II breakdown in Soviet-American relations inevitable? So let's talk about what's happening. So first, the Cold War is an ideological struggle between the Soviet Union, which has an authoritarian form of government, and a communist economic system, versus the United States and Western democracies, which are democratic and market oriented or have a free market. All right, so these are the two sides in the conflict. And the goal for the Soviet Union is to spread communism, right? Because the more countries that exist with your ideological system, the safer you're going to be. And what's going to evolve over time is the United States goal of containment. So in 1946, George Kennan, who works for the State Department and he's in Russia, sends a long telegram back and says, we must contain the Soviet Union. It is a military threat. And if we keep going on with this sort of good feeling that's been developed during World War II, they are going to take over Europe. We can't just become isolationist again. We need to confront the Soviet Union. So that is George Kennan. So what is this sort of containment strategy? How are we going to confront the Soviet Union? Well, there's going to be espionage. So the Soviets are going to have the KGB. We have the CIA. There's an arms race. So once it's clear that we're in a Cold War, both sides want to create an advantage for themselves. And so both sides are going to create bigger and bigger bombs and stronger military tools. All right. And that at times is going to escalate into arms races. All right. And this ideological competition really splits the world in half. So we're competing for the hearts and minds of people in the third world. And as we're going to see, this Cold War is an overarching concept between about 1945 until 1989 or 91. And there are going to be hot wars that are going to exist within this Cold War, all right, or proxy wars. All right. So let's first talk about where this concept comes from of this Cold War. Well, you have Winston Churchill. He loses an election in 1945, and as a private citizen comes to the United States, and he gives a speech in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, in which he says, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Basically, Europe is split between the free Western half and the communist Eastern half. And this is him basically saying, look, we need to confront this new challenge, this new world that we're in right now, this new Cold War. And that was in 1946. All right. The US by 1946 isn't really ready for this. All right. After 1945, everyone is ready to demilitarize, to sort of go back to like a period of normalcy. It's going to take a lot to get the United States to confront this new Cold War and the amount of military spending that's going to be required for it. All right. So here's the Truman Doctrine. So essentially, Britain was in charge of sort of world peace, sort of before the United States. They were sort of the world hegemon. But World War II bankrupts Britain. They have no money. And so they let the United States know that Greece is on the verge of becoming communist, and they don't have the resources, military or financial, to keep Greece non-communist. Would we like to take over for them? And so this is where there's a huge crossroads here. Do we want to see a country fall to communism, or are we willing to use financial and military resources to help? And so this is where the Truman Doctrine gets started. Because of the civil war in Greece, Turkey is being put under pressure by the USSR. And so the US decides, yes, we are going to help countries around the world that are trying to resist communism. And we give $400 million in aid to these countries. So this is really the beginning of anti-communism, the beginning of what our containment strategy for the Cold War is really going to look like. Also, you have Western Europe. After World War II, Western Europe is a complete economic disaster. We're talking about starvation. We're talking about their economies just got completely blown up, literally. So what are we going to do about it? So George Marshall, who's the Secretary of State, says, well, the quickest way to make a country communist is to make everyone poor, right? If everyone's poor and they don't have hope and they don't have property, well, sure, why don't you have the government take over? What could go wrong? So what they decide is, if you want to create buffers against communism, the way you do that is you help a country's economy get started again, and you give people prosperity, and prosperity is a bulwark against communism. So partially as a humanitarian measure, but partially for self-interested national security reasons, we basically take it upon ourselves to rebuild Europe. We offer billions upon billions of dollars back then. Today, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild Europe, all right? And in probably the worst mistake Stalin ever makes, he tells the Eastern Bloc not to accept this money. So this money to reconstruct Europe only goes to Western Europe, all right? This is going to very much help their economy grow, but this is just one piece of the puzzle, all right? Also, another thing to keep in mind, after World War II, America controls about 70% of global manufacturing. We are dominant in a way that almost no country has ever been dominant in world history. So while we're giving all of this money to Western Europe, it's being spent on American exports. It's being spent on stuff that we are going to sell to Europe. So it's not just that we're helping Europe, there are also reasons that it's going to help us as well. All right? That brings us to Germany. So after World War II, a lot of countries are not happy with Germany. And so what happens at first is Germany gets carved up into 4 spheres, right? 4 zones. We have the American zone, the British zone, the Soviet zone, and the French zone. We created a French zone to sort of water down how big the Soviet zone was going to be, because 1/4 is less than 1/3, all right? But as time goes on, we very much, by we I mean the United States and the Soviets, disagree over what post-war Germany should look like. So eventually what ends up happening is these 3 zones, the British, American, and French, merge together into one, and that becomes West Germany. And the Soviet zone becomes East Germany, right? Basically its own country that's a satellite of the Soviet Union. But within the Soviet zone, within Eastern Germany, is Berlin. And Berlin itself is broken up into the 4 zones again. And that's going to create a problem. And the problem is going to be the Soviet Union is in 1948-49 is going to cut off resources to Berlin. Now, they're not moving in with tanks and guns, but they're preventing resources from going into Berlin, trying to sort of starve Berlin out. So the Western Allies have a choice. They could either give in to this aggression because nobody wants World War III. They could start World War III and defend Berlin. Nobody wants that either. And so the compromise that Truman finds between these 2 extremes is the Berlin airlift, which is sending resources through planes. So lifting off about a bunch of planes, and they're going to drop resources into Berlin so that the citizens there aren't going to be sort of starved out by the Soviets. But it's not so clearly an escalation that it's going to lead to war. And this was actually a really good middle way. And after about 9 months, the Soviets backed down. All right. So this again is showing the Americans are willing to do what it takes to stand up to Soviet aggression. All right. And that brings us to the arms race. So as we know, The United States gets the atomic bomb in 1945. We drop it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in a sense, to some degree, we are scaring the Soviets and we're telling them, look at this capability that we have. The Soviets don't get it until 1949. But once they do, both the Americans and the Soviets are going to be building tons of these. And then we're going to get something called mutually assured destruction, where both sides build up as many missiles as possible so that if another country struck first, you would be able to counter and annihilate them as well. So that mutually assured destruction is a big part of the Cold War. All right. And that brings us to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. And the idea is you have Western Europe that is weak and poor, and you have the Soviet Union that is militarily very strong. So what the United States does is it creates an alliance system in Western Europe to prevent the Soviets from coming in, right? It's very, very, very important, all right? But it's a huge departure from traditional American foreign policy, right? Traditional American foreign policy said, one, stay out of Europe's business, and two, we don't need permanent alliances with other nations. But the Cold War is such a huge threat, or the leaders at the time believe it to be such, that they're willing to go in a totally new direction, all right? And that's what NATO is. To counter NATO, we have something called the Warsaw Pact. This is the Soviet Union, and this is basically their NATO. This is their treaty organization, and if any member is attacked, it's as if all countries are attacked. All right. So this is just a general overview. I've definitely left a few things out. For instance, after World War II, so the Soviet Union lost about 25 million people in World War II. That is a very large number. And of course, they don't want to be invaded from Western Europe anymore. So maybe it makes sense that they would put buffers in place between them and Western Europe. You know, the United States, drops an atomic bomb, partially maybe to scare them. Maybe it makes sense that they would try to maintain their military strength. That's not even saying going back to the beginnings of the Russian Revolution in 1918 to 1921, where Wilson and the Americans were part of a force that basically tried to destroy communism before it even got started, right? So the Soviets have lots of reasons to be suspicious of the United States. And of course, as we saw, the United States has lots of reasons to be suspicious of the Soviet Union. But it's important to keep in mind a couple of things. One is the ideological differences, right? One's communist, one's capitalist, but also geopolitics, which is even if we had the same political and economic system, two countries of like having lots of power, right? Real power might be suspicious of each other, regardless of their systems of government or economics. All right. So just a couple questions to consider. Will the United States, a democratic country, be willing to sacrifice what is required to make containment a sustainable policy? So containment becomes basically a multi-decade strategy of the United States. It's very unclear in the 1940s that a country that traditionally has a very small government compared to other countries and doesn't, have alliance systems, doesn't really have a standing army tradition, that we're going to be able to do this policy, right? So whether that's the case, will it be willing to sacrifice what is required? That is an open question. Whose economic system is superior, and how would that influence long-term strategy? There were lots of economic professors at the time that thought communism would probably work based on things like economies of scale. Centralization might be more efficient than a decentralized system. And maybe that might change your strategy. Maybe if you think that communism is a superior economic system, maybe you'd want to use the atomic bomb earlier when you have a military advantage. Or vice versa. Maybe if you think America has a stronger economic system, then maybe containment is a better policy, and the internal contradictions of communism will play themselves out over time, and maybe you don't need a military solution. Maybe economics will solve the problem for you. How much of a departure is America's foreign policy during the Cold War from its traditional foreign policy? Pretty significantly, if you take the view that America is generally an isolationist nation, in the sense that not that we don't, interact with other countries, but we trade with them and we try not to have permanent military alliances. You could argue that it's not that big of a departure from traditional American foreign policy if you think that America protects its strategic national security interests with the power that it has at its disposal. And after World War II, we find ourselves with a lot of economic and military power and a lot of interests around the world. And that could have changed, right? Maybe before just North America mattered, then the Western Hemisphere, and maybe now the whole world matters to some degree. Right? And 4 of the 3 options, detente, containment, and rollback, which do you agree with? So detente is basically, let's just get along with the Soviets, right? Containment is, let's create incentives so that the Soviets maybe do the right things from our point of view and that they don't break out and that communism doesn't spread. And we should put military and economic pressure in place to make that happen, but we shouldn't welcome a war, right? And then rollback. Rollback is essentially wherever communism exists, our goal should be making those places freer, and we should try to push communism backwards, right? We should try to get rid of communism wherever it exists. This is a real war, and we should try to win it in the short run, right? That's it. Remember that in a lot of these speaker notes, there are videos that you should watch, all right? Also, you should read pages 20 to 21 in the textbook so that you can answer the question.